Hey, welcome back to the channel of Birddog Austria. Today, it's a great pleasure to have here Mike Weinfurter. He is from our International Birddog Association, and he is one of the very, very few birddog instructors that are still around on this planet. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, hello everyone. Mike Weinfurter here, IBDA member. Oh, good God, for many, many years now. Back when Phil Phillips was still running the IBDA. I mean, we're talking the 80s. I'm a bird dog instructor. I own my own bird dog. I have since the fall of 2005. It's one of the A model trainers. It came out the factory as one of the dedicated trainers. Been a bird dog instructor for, well, since 2001 now. I also teach in other light and heavy tailwheel airplanes. I seem to specialize in bird dogs, 180s, 185s, more high performance stuff, how that goes. As far as flight time, I've logged almost 20,000 hours total. And I fly for a living for an entity here in the state of Wisconsin. Certificates I hold at ATP single engine, commercial privileges, single engine land and sea, multi-engine land, instrument airplane, flight instructor, UAV pilot. And as far as my teaching, it's primarily in tailwheel airplanes.
What I found out was on the way home, I landed 2 times on grass, and I found out that landing on grass is way easier than on the paved surface. And even today, I still try to land as often as possible on grass strips, especially when there's crosswind. I always go on grass.
If you can, why not? I mean, it's a lot much more forgiving. The tires don't have 100% traction on grass, so there's a whole lot more give there. They're a lot more forgiving, a much greater margin for error, shall we say.
I have a question to you. Why is the Birddog so different compared to other taildraggers?
Okay, very good question, very common question. If you don't mind, I'll use your situation, the Super Cub. I'm guessing either a civilian Super Cub or a former military L21.
Civilian Super Cup with 150 horsepower.
Gotcha. What was its empty weight around the Super Cubs? Probably, maybe
around about 600, a little bit more than half of the Birddog.
Yeah, there is probably one of the biggest surprises people get when first getting into a bird dog. They're used to flying a Super Cub, a Husky, a Cessna 170, a Maul, a Citabria, a Scout maybe. And they all have one thing in common. They're considerably lighter than a bird dog is. Well, that's one of the big surprises the airplane has for a lot of people. They don't realize it weighs as much as it does. Now you look at the darn thing and it doesn't look that big. It doesn't look that heavy because the way it's shaped, it doesn't look like there's that much there in order to make it weigh a lot. It just ain't there. I mean, you look at even a 170 or 180, it physically looks bigger. There's more there. So maybe that might weigh a little bit more if they even think about weight. But Super Cubs, you're talking 800 to sometimes 1,000 pounds empty weight. A light bird dog empty is 1,500 pounds. That's a light one. Very seldom do you see empty weights in a bird dog's 1,500 or less. It's usually 16. Some of them, if they've really loaded them up, they're 1,650, 1,700 very easily. People don't realize how much the airplane weighs. And for example, the analogy I make is it doesn't look like it, but it's in the same empty weight category as a Cessna 180, 182, 185, or 188. The only other exception is the 188 because even that doesn't look like it weighs that much because you just don't there isn't that much there to see.
Mm.
But you think about the other three, and they're big, physically bigger, there's more there. But the Birddog's in the same empty weight category as those and uses essentially the same weight engine. So that's one of the big things that surprises people is they don't realize how heavy it is. It is a heavy, high performance single engine tailwheel airplane. And if they haven't figured that out, the airplane will let them know in short order. It gets it gets your attention in a hurry if you're paying attention. That's one of the surprises of a Birddog. Another one is in its tailwheel steering. If you look at some of the older Cessnas in the early 170s, even the early Cessna 180s, Birddog tailwheel steering is identical to or very similar to their tailwheel steering style.
Mm.
In the 170s and 55 on up, 55 and 6, in the 180s, 56 model year, they came out with a revised tailwheel steering setup where you see two cables coming out of the tail cone and going straight back to the steering arms on the tailwheel. They figured that out. In other words, the earlier design, the steering geometry, as I refer to it, is rather poor. Because think of the steering arm and the tail wheel as being in a plane, okay?
Mhm.
A level plane. Now, normally, if you want that steering arm on the tail wheel to move forward to turn the airplane, the force applied to it ought to be in the same plane. It ought to be at the same level, okay? The newer I'll get my words right yet. Newer style tail wheel steering, the cable comes out of the tail cone and literally goes straight back to the tail wheel steering arms in the same plane at the same level. So when you want a right turn, the right arm goes forward and the application of the force is in this on the same level as the steering arm. So you
Mhm.
get very direct control of the tail wheel steering, left or right. You look at the majority of the Birddogs and the 170s and the early 180s, you have the steering arm and then the steering chain and or spring goes upwards at an angle to the rudder arm. So you've got a force, applied to the steering arm and the tail wheel, maybe, 30, 40 degrees different. You know, the force coming off the chain, off the spring, off the rudder arm is trying to pull it more or less uphill. And the force needed to go to the tail wheel steering arm ought to be level. Do you follow on? It's not easy for me to explain, but it makes a difference because you put the rudder forward, that side tightens up, pulls the arm forward, turns the tail wheel. And there's sometimes some slack can get in there. You'll see the chain in the spring sag a little bit.
And
Whereas,
you can't lock the tail wheel like many planes can.
no, you cannot. I've never yet seen a Birddog with a lockable tail wheel.
Exactly.
That's something unique to the 180, 185, and 188,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Now, Cessna did build roughly 100 Birddogs with that later style tail wheel steering like the 180 and 185 have.
Ah, okay. Didn't know that.
Yes, there are roughly 100 of them. They went primarily to a training base in Texas at San Marcos, Texas. Of those roughly 100 built, there are maybe two or three left that exist.
Okay.
And that's it. Where the rest of them went, Lord only knows. Um, that's one of the big things in a Birddog. It doesn't have that good a tail wheel steering as compared to the later Cessnas. And
I'm not quite sure about the center of gravity in the bird dog. Is it because I personally have the feeling that the center of gravity in the plane is way higher compared to other tail draggers?
well, I mean, wait, a higher, you mean?
Higher, yeah,
Uh,
because when you compare the Super Cup, the wings of the Super Cup are a minimum of 1 feet lower than the bird dog, And also
Mm-hmm.
the 180, the wings are lower than the Birddog. The wings of the Birddog are very high.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see what you're saying, yeah. But see, when I talk about center of gravity, I think of a fore and aft distance
Oh
in
no,
the airframe.
I was
Yeah, but I see what you're saying, yeah.
yeah,
I guess in this country, another way of describing that would be what you might hear out of pilots here is it's much more top heavy. The weight is much higher in the airframe.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
the
what I
weight
mean.
is much higher up in the airframe. And yes, that can make a difference too.
You see it on
That makes a
taxi
difference.
how the
Hmm.
wings are rocking with the spring gear, and also the spring gear is a very special thing on the Birddog.
Hmm. There was one I flew for probably 300 or 400 hours. You familiar with the wedges in the Birddog gear?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. This airplane had no wedges in it.
No, really, come on.
In taxiing on grass, it got the wiggin' and wagging. I just thought that was because of the spring gear, and I'd flown other spring gear Cessnas. And then we took it in for annual one year, pulled the cover plates down on the gear leg, look up in the gearbox by the big bracket, and one of them was damaged because the top of the gear leg was banging against it because the wedges weren't there.
Wow.
So we put two wedges in to fill up the space. For all we know, that same bracket is still in that same airplane. Maybe you don't want to put that in a video, but so yeah, I know what you mean about a wagon. Yeah, they are. It's always top heavier. The weight is much higher, so
Yeah,
that can be a factor in it too. And
yeah,
heck, the pilot sits up higher.
yeah.
Yep, all those things make a difference. So yeah, weight of the airplane, if people don't realize how heavy it is, tail wheel steering isn't the best Cessna ever made. It's still doable. One of the things I find with the tail wheel steering is either if you got the longer, skinnier springs back there with the chain or the short, fat springs, those springs do wear out. And
Mm.
there's a lot of people said, well, I don't know, it's always kind of steered kind of sloppy taxiing. I never really thought of it. They always compensate with brake and this and that and whatever, and just the way it is, those springs weaken. And if you can pull the coils apart with your hand without a lot of effort, they're probably gotten tired.
Mm.
Cetabrias and decathlons run into that same thing because all they have is a spring on each side and they get tired. They weaken and oh, gee, this thing doesn't steer as good as it used to. Well, the springs are probably tired. Put new springs on. Guess what? The strength is there again. The steering authority is there. Happens with the Birddog too.
So, but it's no way that you just put out one element of the chain.
Well, you can, but the spring is still weak.
Ah,
So
okay, yeah, of
the
course.
spring is going to stretch and take away some of the input from your foot on the rudder
Mm,
that you should have.
mm,
You know, so it's not a good thing. Yeah, you can shorten the chains, but all you're doing is stretching the spring out some more. You still lost, and sometimes that can affect whether the darn thing shimmies. If you got too much play in the chain and it's sagging a little bit, it's like driving around an old car or truck without power steering, and the ball joints are wore. Next thing you know, you're driving down a road, and to keep the vehicle going straight, you're wiggling that steering wheel back and forth quite a bit because there's excess play in the thing. Same thing if the chains are sagging or the springs are weak.
yeah.
You're putting in inputs with the rudder and nothing's happening. Or finally something does happen, it's too much or more than you wanted, and then the fun starts. So it's amazing all those little things that add up to an easy airplane to handle or a real bad one.
Yeah. Was the heavy weight a reason for the designers to put flap 60 on this plane?
Y flap 60?
Yeah, because of the weight of the Birddog?
Not so much the weight, from what we've been able to gather, is the Army had very specific requirements for the size of runway they wanted the airplane to get in and out of. And they found out, I think, rather quickly that 40 degrees flaps wasn't enough. If you want to get down and get stopped, 40 degrees wasn't cutting it. It would float too far, even at slow speeds.
Mm.
and hence the 60. Um, and interesting, the airplane was, when it was certified, not only as a military aircraft, it was certified at the same time as a civilian aircraft. And then had to pass what they call a bulk landing climb test, to where the airplane was loaded to gross weight. Um, Say you screwed up the landing, bounced it badly, the airplane had to climb at max power a minimum of 200 to 250 feet a minute with full flaps.
Oh, with full flat.
And the Birddog will do it.
Yeah.
I've done it in Texas on a hot summer day, loaded to gross and then some. You, I show it, I demonstrate it to students. You get all the way down into the stall, it breaks. I says, okay, go around. Max power, break the stall and climb with flap 60, and there it sits at 200 to 250 feet a minute with full flaps, just as safe as ever. So the airplane will do it. Since we're on 60 degrees flaps and talking about those wonderful devices out there, a lot of people are leery to afraid of using full flaps in the airplane. Now, the Army, that's the only way they taught it in the U.S. Army. Every landing was a full flap landing. And in teaching and flying them, I discovered something. It's called best glide speed, which in a Birddog is 75 miles an hour, 65 knots. And if you fly a normal size pattern, not a super tight pattern, definitely not an airline size, you know, 3 miles away on downwind type thing and 5 mile final. Fly a normal type pattern, as long as you maintain 75 indicated or 65 knots indicated, you can be descending at full flaps. It'll be a touch of power. You'll be maintaining best glide, and the airplane handles beautifully. Where people get in trouble is they get slow with it and get behind what's called behind the power curve. But as long as you maintain best glide, there, even with full flaps, the airplane comes down just fine. You're talking, oh, on a strong headwind, maybe 800 feet a minute. On a normal to light to no winds, 1,200 a minute descent rate on final. No big deal. In fact, I teach that way. I get the person on down and I said, okay, trim for 75 miles an hour, hands off. They do. I said, okay, I'll beam the numbers, flaps 30, it'll pitch for 75. Turn base, flaps 45. It pitches by itself for 75 because it's trimmed to fly at 75. Turn final, flap 60. They find themselves pulling a little more power, if not power off, full flaps at 70 to 75 indicated, and it's coming down just fine. No problem, no big deal, not behind the power curve. Here's the key. With that much drag, when you get down and get ready to flare, it's like flying a very high drag biplane, a Stearman, for example. A lot of drag there. You've got to time the flare properly, because when that nose comes up, it's done.
Mm.
So you have to time the flare properly. You flare to where you're going to be 3 to 5 feet high with flaps full, power off. It's going to quit flying before the tires get to the runway. So you have to time it properly. It's not difficult. It may take a little practice. You can't drag, it doesn't like being dragged in with power at flap 60 because it's going to get slow. And that's when the weight takes over. You may be used to flying a Super Cubs, a Tabri, a 170, Maul, whatever. Oh, I can start pitching up with full flaps and power off because I still have some glide left. You do that in a Birddog, the speed goes away in a hurry. She
Yeah.
comes down now and the teeth come out and the Birddog takes a bite. Out
Yeah.
you go. So flap 60 are no big deal. Before I finish checking someone out in a 305, they will be doing flap 60 landings. In fact, they get to where they actually like them.
Mm.
They think they're kind of fun.
For me, they are no big deal because I always learn flap 60 from my dad. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I have a very short runway with 550 feet. So with wind, it's no problem, but without wind, 550 feet, you have to land on point.
Mm-hmm. You have to put it down on the end.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's why I always use flap 60 there. But when with crosswind, to be honest, I never use flap 60. What are your thoughts about flap 60 and crosswind?
Mm-hmm. My thoughts on those, generally with crosswinds, I use no more than 30-degree flaps, if at all possible, because it is a Cessna. The flaps are very effective, but they do create a fair amount of dirty air, shall we say, coming off the flaps and off the wing where the flaps are. You have turbulent air hitting the tail feathers. And it can affect pitch. It can also affect yaw. So while you won't lose the rudder 100%, the rudder effectiveness is reduced with flaps out. It's why Cessna recommends, it doesn't prohibit, but it recommends not more than 10 degrees flaps on a lot of the civilian Cessnas, the 172s, 182s, whatever. And the same applies to the round-tailed and square-tailed Cessna tailwheel airplanes. Rudder effectiveness is reduced some. Who knows how much some is, but it is reduced with flaps out. So crosswinds, I generally recommend no more than 30 degrees. So you maintain a fair amount, a reasonable amount of rudder effectiveness.
Is there a limit, a crosswind limit for the Birddog where you say you shouldn't land with 20 knots, 30 knots crosswind? Is there a limit?
Yes, there is. In fact, it's a Cessna published limit. It's been around, as far as I know, since day one. Max demonstrated crosswind component for the airplane at 90 degrees is 15 knots.
Yeah.
That's it. And I've been in those winds, and it you may be at the limit stops.
Mm.
Now, mind you, for certification, it had to prove it could safely take off and land with those winds. And down in Kansas, you know, 15, 20 knots is a light breeze. I mean, that
Mm.
that state lives in breeze, high winds. So, the airplane passed certification, but 15 knots is max demonstrated wind limit for a Birddog.
Yeah.
Now, you can use a crosswind component chart to figure out if you're at your limit or not, if it's less than 90. In fact, a lot of people carry that chart in the airplane with them. Doesn't take but a moment to look it up, what the winds are, what the runway is. Am I within my limit or not? So, yeah, I would no more than 15 knots at 90 degrees and generally no more than 30 recommended with a crosswind. And that's why.
This YouTube star here tried to land a Birddog, and this shows a total loss of directional control. She went to the right, added brakes, and now look at that, how she went to the left. She was very lucky that she didn't ground loop the plane. This is the original picture from the movie, and here you can now see the ground loop. Lady, you were so close to this, you can't imagine. But what about crosswinds?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, regarding crosswind landings in a Birddog, and this is just a personal preference, use it or not. People often ask me, do I always 3-point land or do I always wheel land in a crosswind? And for myself, I have a general rule that I've lived by that's worked quite well for me, in that if it's a steady crosswind, um, I'll do either one. It depends mostly on my mood at the time. If it's a steady crosswind, light or strong, but it has to be steady. The airplane really doesn't care which method you use. However, if it's a gusting crosswind, I will land it every time. And the reason being is when that airplane touches the runway, I want to be fully
You,
under control of that aircraft.
you land with a gusty crosswind. You didn't say how you land. You land two-point
Wheel land. The
wheel.
gusty crossland, I'll wheel it on every time.
Okay.
And the reason being is with the wheel landing, the airplane is still flying. It is not stalled. You are essentially, still flying when the airplane touches the runway. So, and then now the couple of important things on why, because that always comes up. First of all is the approach method. As we all know, there are usually two methods for doing a crosswind approach. One is wings level, crabbed into the wind, and then straighten it when you're very close to the runway. The other one is align the airframe with the center line of the runway and lower the upwind wing enough to keep the airplane from drifting. People like the flat approach because they don't like flying with the wing down. If you're doing that, some people consider that to be cross-controlled, and they're afraid of flying cross-controlled because the potential for stalling cross-controlled. They also like sitting level. Here I teach and I do the airframe aligned with the center line of the runway and the upwind wing lowered to keep from drifting. For one very important reason. And it goes back to the basics of just flying and tailwheel flying in general, especially. You have one main job with that aircraft when you're taking off and landing it with a tailwheel is you must take off and land straight. With the CG behind the mains and all the other little reasons, they do not like taking off and especially landing in a crooked or in a crab, because that only especially in landing, that's only the beginning of a potential ground loop because you're getting that center of gravity moving, possibly trying to swap places with the main gear. Whereas if you're lined up straight and you keep it straight all the way through touchdown and rollout, and you use the upwind wing down to keep it from drifting, you may land on the tail wheel in the upwind main first, but you will be straight. And there's much less chance of getting the center of gravity moving and trying to swap ends with the main gear, aka trying to start a ground loop. Now, people ask me, well, what difference does it make? I can kick it straight right before I land. Okay, fine. You're coming down crabbed. It's a pretty strong crosswind. Are you going to have enough rudder to straighten the airplane before you touch down? If you turn final and line up the airframe however far out on final, you have two things. You have time because you have altitude, and that gives you, the altitude gives you the time, because you then can find out if you have enough rudder to keep the aircraft straight through touchdown or not. And if not, you have the time due to the altitude to make that adjustment. Also, how much wing do you hold down to keep from drifting? And as I tell students, when you do that a mile away, theoretically, at 500 feet, you have much more time to figure out if you can keep it straight or not versus 50 to 100 feet in 3 to 5 seconds before touchdown. It's a lousy time to find out that you don't have enough rudder or you can't stop it from drifting or both. And then fun starts.
I agree. Yeah.
Yes. But like, again, that's how I teach. That's what I do. What someone else does is totally up to them.
Yeah.
My total tail wheel time out of just shy of 20,000 hours, is around 8,000 total in tail wheel. And
Wow.
that's everything a DC3's on down.
Really amazing.
Yes, I worked for Basler for a while. I was a first officer on piston DC3s there.
Amazing.
Oh, yeah, in fact, I got a lot of my training from Warren Basler himself. And since we're talking about crosswinds and wheel landings and all that good stuff, of all places, I learned how to wheel land in the DC3 from Warren. And I use that method to this day.
Mm-hmm.
So we might as well talk about that while we're at it.
To this, because all those interviews I've done with those Birddog legends, I call them.
Yeah.
The Army training at Fort Rucker, Alabama, has always been 3-point. They never landed on wheels. Why was that?
I think primarily, and this is my guess, primarily because they were teaching those people to go into very short runways. And the thinking of the time on the way to get that airplane down and stopped in a very short distance is with a 3-point. A wheel landing, even the method I teach, takes room. Doesn't take a lot of room, but it will take a lot more runway length than a 3-point full stall landing.
Yeah.
And those people were training to operate out of runways, which may be nothing more than a dike and a rice paddy in Vietnam, or God knows where that were maybe, if you're lucky, 700 to 1,200 feet long. That's with 200-foot tall trees around it or taller. Down at Fort Rucker, there was rolling hills and farmland and patches of woods, not unlike majority Wisconsin. They had no tight spaces to teach pilots how to fly into short runways with tall obstacles. They planted trees around dirt roads and sand roads, and that became their tactical airfields out in the countryside. You'd be driving along through rolling hills and farmland and patches of, hardwoods, and there's this rectangular chunk of 200-foot tall pines on either side of a road, dirt or sand road, usually with a dog leg in it. And the runway inside those pines was about 700 to 1,200 feet long. And those are the runways they used for that, as they called it, the tactical phase of their Birddog training, because that's what they had to learn how to get in and out of when they were flying combat. God knows where that might be. That's probably why everything was a 60-degree flap landing, and probably why it was a 3-point, because they needed to get in and get out.
Okay. Good explanation.
Yeah, and to me, you look in Lovable 19er, you'll see some of the training pictures, and it looks like they're on a 2-rut dirt or sand road. And it looks like in the background around the airplane looks like old pines and tall pines. That was one of the takeoff or landing at one of those tactical strips back in the Rucker training days.
Cool. I didn't know that.
Oh yes, it's quite something, because here's something I said, rolling farmland and hardwood, lots of trees and there's this bunch of 200-foot tall pines there for no good reason. That's where the runways were. The darndest things. That's probably why everything was taught 3-point.
Okay. Is there a special speed? Because I've done now a little bit more than 1,200 landings with the Birddog, and I still recognize, I know the plane, but there is a special speed range where the ground loop tendency suddenly increases. Because when you come in and the plane is on the ground, all normal pilots think, great landing, that's it. But
no, that's when the fun starts.
But not with the Birddog, yeah?
Oh, no.
And when the plane gets a little bit slower, then suddenly you feel it. Whoa, now the plane wants to go left and right. Why is that?
Well, again, I'll share my best thoughts on that. You're slowing down. As you slow down, the tail feathers are becoming less and less effective, especially the rudder. And when the rudder is done being effective, what's left? You've got the brakes and the tail wheel steering.
Mm.
And if your tail wheel's worn some and the steering springs are a little weak, and maybe one of the arms on your tail wheel are bent up a little too much, so you don't have as effective as steering, there's not a lot left to keep it straight with when that weight, remember how it's a heavy airplane as far as tailwheel airplanes go for its size, it's a heavier airplane and people forget about that. Well, that weight starts going because there's a little bit of an input. A gust of wind hits the vertical fin. You're going down a grass runway and one tire hits a little bit of a bump and jolts the airplane just a hair in that direction. You know, if something starts the weight moving.
Yeah.
And it's at a slower speed and you don't have a lot left to fight back with.
Mm.
And if your steering is worn, about all you've got left then are the brakes.
Yeah.
So if that's my best guess on that.
And there's also a thing that I recognized when flying. When I have my wife sitting in the back, the tendency for a ground loop for me is less.
Mm-hmm.
When I fly alone, the tendency that the plane wants to go to the right or to the left side for me is way higher than when I have my wife sitting in the back. Maybe there's some extra weight that pushes down the tail wheel.
It might be, yes. It might be. The additional weight of her or anyone else back there might help stabilize the airplane because you've got more weight lower in the airplane.
Yeah.
Instead of you sitting way up high and nothing else, now you've got more weight after you sitting much, well, what, 2 feet lower? Something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that might well be.
Mm.
It might be a stabilizing force in the whole works.
Mm.
It's amazing how that goes. So when we were talking about all that stuff, this may not be for the video either. It's a short story for you. I learned wheel landings in a Birddog at night.
Okay.
Yeah. By myself. This is at Fort Hood in the Flying Club. And I've heard all the stories over time. Well, you got to come in fast. And when you come in fast, you got to push the stick forward to keep it on the ground when the mains hit the runway. And of course, with that spring gear, if you don't do it right, it's going to bounce. You hear all these wonderful stories, some of them scary as hell. And the last thing I wanted to do was be trying to practice or learn wheel landings and have all my buddies at the flying club standing there on the ramp watching and laughing. So I went out and did it at night when nobody was around by myself. Now I had a 10,000 by 200 foot wide runway to play on. And the guys in third shift in the tower at Fort Hood just loved it because I kept them awake. Just because they were counting every takeoff and landing was an operation, you know. They loved it. But I learned to come in flat and come in fast.
Mm.
And through lots of practice, I learned when to push forward and how much. But I also told myself when I was doing this, that if this thing so much as wiggles or whatever, I'm going around because I am not going to get into a crow hopping mess bouncing this thing back and forth and up and down and God knows what. So if this thing so much as blinks, I'm going around.
Mm.
And through sheer practice and probably some naivete on my part and whatever else, I was only 20 or 21 at the time. So maybe not the greatest amount of smarts either. I figured out how to do it that way. And I read an article one time about basically don't do that. Then the article says set it up on final. Speed, configuration, power, and all that. to where you got it coming down at a gentle rate of descent. The speed really doesn't matter. You can be 2 knots above stall or 2 knots below red line. The big thing is the rate of descent. Coming at too high a rate of descent, you impact the runway too hard. You're going to build up energy in the tires and the gear, and you're going back up in the air. Anywhere from a skip to a full-blown bounce.
Yep.
So the thing is a gentle rate of descent. So here you're coming down final, and you got it hands off how you want, right? Now you roll in a touch of nose down trim. And just enough to where you got to hold a little bit of back pressure to maintain what you had hands off. And someone says, how much back pressure? And I tell people roughly the same amount of back pressure you would hold on the elevator in a normal turn, which is basically pretty much just enough to where you know you're doing it. That sound about right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So here you are with that touch nose down trim, holding that little bit of back pressure. You got everything set up the way you want. And down you come. And this is part one of the wheel landing. You'll see what I mean. When the mains touch, don't do a thing with the stick. Don't frickin' move the control stick. Nothing. When the mains touch, reduce power a little bit. Not all the way to idle. Just a little bit. Now you had it set up beautifully. You got that little bit of nose down trim. When the mains touch, you reduce the power. Here's what happens. The combination of the power reduction means a speed reduction, means a lift reduction. And that, combined with that little bit of nose down trim, glues it on for you. You don't have to figure out when or how much to push forward. It does it for you. And I read that. I went out and tried it, and it's so freaking easy. It's cheating.
I like it. Yeah, it's good.
It really, really works. Really, really works. I thought, God dang it, that sure is a lot easier. Wish I'd known that when I was out there doing it at night by myself. So, and after a while, once you get used to that, you'll find yourself not even rolling in the nose down trim anymore. You got it set up hands off, you got the speed, you got the rate of descent, you got everything the way you want it. You find that if you just leave it alone, when the mains touch, make that power reduction, and it'll glue on for you. You won't need the nose down trim. So that's the first part of the wheel landing. Now you're on the runway, under control, rolling down the runway, keeping it straight and not drifting. Not a thing behind you with the two flappers has got to come down. An awful lot of people hold that in the air until it comes down on its own. Bad idea. Well, why? Well, let's think about it. When the tail's starting to come down on its own, what's happening is the elevator is losing effectiveness. And so is the rudder. Well, gee, why should that make a difference? Real simple. It's starting to come down on its own, which means the tail feather's effectiveness is almost dead, if not dead. That's why the tail's coming down. There's no more lift back there. What happens if you catch a gust at that time? You got nothing to fight back with because you lost your rudder control. There goes your directional control. The tail wheel isn't on the ground yet. And a little side note, on the ground, the tail wheel is 90% of your directional control. That's shared with me by an old-time Army Korean era Birddog pilot. So the tail wheel isn't there to help. The rudder's dying or dead. You catch a gust, what do you have left to keep it straight with is the brakes. That's all you got. Because the rudder ain't going to help and the tail wheel ain't going to help. Okay, so fine. How do you fix that? Here's where the DC-3 training comes in. And this came from Warren. Gruff bugger on the ground. Oh, he could be a gruff, grumpy SOB on the ground. But that man loved to fly. and he loved to share it. He's okay. He says, you're landing this, every landing will be a wheel landing. There will be no 3-point full stall landings in this airplane. Mainly because if you fully stall a DC-3, it can take upwards of 3,500 to 7,000 feet to recover. Not 30 feet. Oh yeah, when it's done, it's done. So of course I'm in the right seat looking at him going, okay, what do you want me to do? He says, you get it on the mains, you're straight, you're not drifting. He says, fly the tail to the ground. That's how he put it. He says, lower the tail to the ground while the elevator and the rudder are still effective. He says, don't slam the tail wheel down. That's coming down too fast. Don't hold it up till it's done on its own, because then you got nothing. He says, fly the tail to the ground. And I've been using that too. So the method about the nose down trim and the power reduction is part one. Part two is fly the tail to the ground while the tail feathers are still effective. If you catch a gust at that time, you've got something to fight back with.
Yeah.
And if you can't stop the swerve or the wing going up, you can always throw the power to it and go around.
Mm.
You've got three options there. I teach that. I believe it. It works.
Mm.
So, like I said, it's not the only way to wheel land one. It's not the only one way to come down final for a crosswind landing,
Yeah.
but it works. And it's amazing how well it works.
But we are doing this for the beginners, and I think this is a very good advice.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
What are your thoughts about this video?
Well, I'll tell you what I think happened, and then I'm going to ask you if you know what really happened, okay?
Yeah.
I see it, it's showing it to me there 3-4 times. Came in slow, looked like he was all set. To me, it looks like he got a little too slow and the left wing stalled and dropped. That's what it looks like to me.
Yeah.
And,
Correct.
The left wing came back up. It was more or less, level, nose up. Had he been smart, he would have chopped the power and quit right there. Unfortunately, I don't know if he forgot to keep the power in because he got scared or tried to recover and didn't go to full power, but the airplane was still stalled to darn near 100% stalled. When he kept going, apparently a gust or whatever else helped him lift back up a few feet, increase the angle of attack. Now we stall again. Now it drops and it hits this side and spins around and hits that side. How close did I come?
Very good.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, very good. The point was we were flying at the European Birddog meeting, and this was a model airplane field where we landed, and it had a length of, let's say, 650 feet.
Yeah.
But we had on this day, we had 10 to 12 knots wind directly at the nose. It can't be better.
You couldn't ask for better winds is right on the nose like that.
Yeah, it can't
To
be
me, it
better.
just looks like he got too slow and got behind the power curve and installed the left wing.
For me, to be honest, there's a point where the pilot became a passenger.
Yeah, I can see that. It's amazing how many people get into a situation like that and they get scared.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
When I land, for me, a personal tip Jim Mulvihill gave me this. Focus at the point at the end of the runway, and don't look right and left, and put your plane into this point, and then you have a pretty good feeling if the plane starts moving to the right or to the left side.
You're going to see it.
Yeah.
If you're concentrating, you got takeoff and landing. You one job. Here's something I should go along with this. I asked people how they're going to take off, and they start giving you this long litany of what they're going to do and when and how for takeoff. I said, throw all that away. I said, line it up in the center. When you're ready to go, go. Now, in your mind, all you've got to do is think of 3 words over and over and over, and that's keep it straight.
Yeah.
Just keep it straight, keep it straight, keep it straight, keep it straight. In your mind, over and over that fast. The airplane will accelerate. You're keeping it straight. The tail will come up with it when it's ready, as high as it's supposed to. And if you've got it trimmed right, the darn thing will lift off the ground and start flying without any help from you. All you had to do was keep it straight. And an interesting story behind that. And I said, now landing, you've got 6 things to remember over and over. Keep it straight, slow it down. Keep it straight, slow it down. Landing is simple. You've got to keep it straight, line it up straight, set it down straight with no drift. And that doesn't matter if you're in an ultralight tail dragger or DC-3 or anything big or small. You got to keep it straight and you cannot be drifting. It's amazing those little things you pick up like that, but I use that method to this day teaching, and people can't believe how easy it is for the airplane to fly. They don't have to pick up the tail. They don't have to figure out a speed to rotate. All you got to do is keep it straight, and on landing, keep it straight and slow it down. It works. It's amazing how it works. So there's some thoughts on takeoffs and landings in the airplane.
Which flap setting do you use for takeoff?
If I'm not in a hurry to get off the ground quickly, anywhere from 0 to 30. A lot of times, no more than 30 in a Birddog.
Yeah.
And
I go with around 15, to be honest.
Well, with electric flaps, you can, yes.
Yeah.
We found out with the electric flap Birddogs, you use, say, 10 to 15 degrees flaps and just do a normal takeoff, nothing special, just normal everyday takeoff. The airplane spends less time on the runway and generally is a little less squirrely. With just 10 or 15 degrees in a normal takeoff. With me, it's usually either 0 or 30.
Yeah.
With lots of runway, I know it's going to climb well and just ready to go, I just go. If it's a shorter runway, most definitely 30.
Yeah.
It's because not only that, there's no performance specs for 10 or 15 or 20 either. People often wonder why the Army went to electric flaps in the Birddogs. They found out due to the landing accidents and the ground loops, a lot of them at the time were when the pilots were rolling down the runway after a landing, reaching down and leaning over to the left to retract the flaps.
Okay.
And especially if you're going 50, from 30 to 0 in manual flaps in a Birddog, it can be, if they don't have it adjusted properly, that latching the flap handle in the full up position, might take a little bit of a push, and that can be enough for some people to distract them from the other thing they're supposed to be doing at the same time, which is keeping the airplane straight. They get fixated on futzing with the flaps. They forget job 1 is keep it straight. And that's when the fun starts. So they learn that if they go to electric flaps, they just sit there and reach over and flip the toggle switch forward or up, depending on the airplane. And they do a lot better on paying attention to job 1, which is keep it straight. So that's where I look at for flaps. All depends on the length of the runway, the surface of the runway. Usually on skis, it's flaps 30 all the time.
What would be,
What
or
else
what
have we got to talk about?
we should talk about? What are your thoughts about a bounced landing?
A bounce
Especially,
landing?
especially a bounced landing in crosswind.
Go around.
Yeah.
Go around. When it's not just a skip and it's a full-fledged bounce,
Mhm.
you're going back up, but the airplane is slowing down
Mhm.
because when it's going back up, it's bleeding off that energy it built up when it hit the runway in the first place. And then probably the person is too startled to think to put the power in to go around, so you're not accelerating. So you're going back up and you're slowing down at the same time. Not a good, and then the fun can start. It comes back down, you might start crow hopping, it might swerve on you. You have a good definite bounce, go around.
Yeah.
Too many of airplanes have been damaged or lost when they tried to save a bounced landing.
Exactly.
Too many.
And
Go
I
around.
did all the crash research from the FAA crash statistics,
Mm-hmm.
and the conclusion was that most of the ground loops and accidents happened with a full flap bounced landing in crosswind.
Mm-hmm. And it startled them and they bounce and they go, oh shit. And when they do that, they forget to fly the airplane because they're busy being startled. And there you go. And then none of that, they get behind the airplane too.
I've got two more things we should talk about. One
Sure.
thing is when you land with full flap and you have to go around. I know from my personal experience, never go around with flap 60, always reduce to 45 or 30 even. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, let's be a little more specific. You bounce and you go around, correct?
Yeah.
Flap 60, correct? Okay. Well, you're going to have the first thing, max power and pitch for the airspeed and start a climb. At least stop the descent and start a gentle climb. You may never mind what the airspeed is, but stop, go max power, stop the descent with pitch and start a climb. The airplane will fly at full flaps in a climb at gross at 200 to 250 feet a minute. It'll do it. And I make people practice that before I check them out in a Birddog, so they know they can do it. Because the bounce and the go around may be such that they need to get airspeed first.
Mm-hmm.
You need to get airspeed first, and the airplane will hold altitude and it will start to climb. If you get airspeed, and you're talking in the 60-mile-an-hour range, maybe 50 to 60. But I've seen it happen. People go to max power, and the first thing they do is they drop from 60 to 45 degrees flaps. And what happens next? They hit the runway because they've dumped so much lift and they don't have any airspeed. It's coming back down.
Yeah.
You've got to start accelerating and get the lift out of it, and then gradually go from 60 to 45 and less. Go to 45, accelerate some more. When you get as much as you'll get, go to 30, accelerate again. When it stops accelerating, then you can finish going to full up and accelerate to normal climb.
Yeah. That's
But
maybe an advantage of the electric flaps because it takes some time.
it helps. They help.
Yeah.
They still can come up pretty quick. So because the main thing is you can't just sit there and pick the flaps up. You've got to be accelerating and at least stopping the descent to where you're holding the 20 feet above the ground that you're at.
Yeah.
The whole thing is to not come back down. So
Another thing is, for me, the most important thing to avoid loss of directional control is to be the master of the brakes.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on that?
Why don't you define be the master of the brakes?
Because you have to be very quick to react if the plane tries to break out. And I always stop it by giving it a hard brake on one side to stop the tendency to break out. But you have to be fast. If you wait too long, you have lost.
Well said. I understand what you're saying now. There's people who get in trouble with bird dogs and tailwheel airplanes because they're slow to react.
Mhm.
They're going to let the airplane go 5 or 10 degrees
Mhm.
before they even start to do something. And then there's some people, for whatever reason, the airplane wiggles back and forth left to right at the nose because they're already constantly moving the rudders when they don't need to because there's no reason to. And here's what I can share about that regarding directional control is your main job is to keep the airplane going straight and takeoff and landing. And you must, that has to be job one. That has to be your primary focus in takeoff and landing is keeping the airplane straight. And to do that, you don't let the airplane get more than a degree or two off of straight before you do something about it.
Mhm.
And now if it's going straight and you're keeping it straight, that's great. But you have to be ready to move the rudders and apply brake if necessary to keep the airplane from deviating from straight.
Yeah.
One of the ways I share it is your job in keeping it straight is you use the rudders and the brake move them as often or as little as you need, as slow or as quick as you need, for as long as it takes, be that a half a second or 10 seconds or whatever it is, to keep that airplane going straight.
Yeah.
And you have to be ready to do that. If you're complacent in directional control and it starts swerving on you and you don't notice it, you've created your own problem.
Sure.
You have to be ready to straighten it out if it starts to go do anything except go straight. And you use as much or little rudder as you need and as much or little brake as you need for as little or as long as you need to do it to keep it straight.
Yeah. Especially I have on my Birddog, I have those brake discs. I don't have the original brakes. I have the discs, and the disc
The Clevelands?
the Clevelands, thanks, yeah.
Yes.
And the Cleveland brakes, they react very aggressive sometimes. And, the experience, and I think it's important that I share this because on my first landing where I told you I used almost all the wide of the run, I overcorrected all the time. So it's landed me from the left to the right, to the left to the right. It doesn't happen anymore today, but in the beginning, I didn't really have the feeling about the brakes, and I think it should be very important that before people take off with the new Birddog, they should taxi a lot with the Birddog to get a feeling for the brakes and everything.
Very well said. Not only will they get the feeling for how effective the brakes are, but they'll get in taxiing a very good idea of how well the rudder works and how well the tailwheel steering works. And just taxiing on an airport with taxiway centerline stripes, the yellow stripes. One of the first things I have them do is, okay, let's taxi the airplane. We're going to go up this hangar row, down that hangar row, down that taxiway, turn around, come back to, and it says, your main job here is you keep this airplane on that yellow line out in front of you. If you can keep it straight and keep it on that yellow line taxiing, you're going to learn a lot of what you need to know to keep the airplane straight and down the center line of the runway on takeoff and landing.
Yeah.
It's a building block towards learning how to take off and land. Taxiing keep it on the taxiway center line.
Yeah.
And you be in all the tight turns, all the gentle turns, all the everything, but you keep that taxiway stripe in the center. When you're
Mhm.
looking at the Birddog out the windshield to get the center strip, if you look at it just right, it'll, in your eyes, it'll look like there's two strips with a clear gap in between. Ever notice that when you're sitting in it or taxiing? Okay. Well, you can use that visual cue and use that clear area between the two windshield center strips as your gun sight.
Mhm.
Put the center line of the runway, the center line of the taxiway in that space between those two strips and keep it there.
Mm.
Taxiing, speeding up, slowing down at whatever speed, you use whatever rudder and brake you need, you keep it there. No matter what, you keep it there. And you wouldn't believe how well that helps people learn the inputs they need to keep it straight, takeoff and landing.
Yeah.
They can do it slow taxiing where they got to use a lot more rudder, a lot more brake, and maybe a fair amount of power. That's half the battle.
There is on the army made a training video, for sure you know that. And there's one thing in the video that I really like very much is they say, keep your heels down when you land. Because people stand on the brakes when they land on the Birddog, and this could cause big troubles.
Yes, it could, because when they put their feet on the pedals, sometimes they put their feet too high up on the pedals.
Yeah.
And you can tell people who have their feet up too high in the airplane. Keep a good watch out on the brake linings on the right side.
Mhm.
Because the people have their feet too far up on the pedals, not only putting in right rudder for takeoff to keep it straight, they're unknowingly adding right brake. So they're riding the right brake and grinding it down sooner. And all you got to do is look at the brake lining on right versus left. And the right one's usually worn down quite a bit more. That usually means they're riding too much brake on takeoff and not enough rudder because they got their feet up too high.
Exactly.
Here's one thing I found that works for most people is take the balls of your feet and put them across the bottom of the pedal. That's that part of the pedal that's about an inch high, side to side, with a little tab on the end.
Yeah.
Put the balls of your feet across that. And then let your heels rest where they rest.
Yeah.
Some people, if they have small feet, their heels are off the floor. Larger, longer feet, heels are on the floor. But keep the balls of your feet across the bottom of the pedal. And from that position with your feet on the rudders, you can apply brake right now without having to slide them up to get to the brakes to apply it. All you got to do is tip your toes forward. It works.
Yeah.
Put the balls of your feet across the bottoms of those pedals. I do it myself. It works. And for some people, say, well, I still feel like I'm riding the brakes. Okay, feet are positioned that way. Heels on the floor, balls of the feet across the bottom of the pedal. I said, now curl your toes back away from the pedals enough to where you know you're doing it. You can feel you're doing it. That'll help remind you that you're off the brakes, but you're ready to apply brake if you need to. And you can apply brake from that position with your feet like that in an instant. In an instant.
Yeah.
It works.
Yeah.
Give it a try sometime. And for people, especially with larger feet too, taller feet, longer ones, said put your balls of your feet across there. That'll help you remind yourself.
That's true.
The little things that work, it's amazing sometimes what you come up with. So
you know what is funny about us taildragger pilots? We all have the same mindset about a nose wheel or a taildragger, yeah? We all say the only way of flying is with a taildragger, but when it's about 2-point or 3-point landing,
you want to get two pilots or two groups of pilots arguing, you can throw one of the following questions at them. What's better, high wing or low wing? What's better, tail wheel or training wheels? Yes, that's what I call tri gears. And what's better, wheel landings versus 3 points? Last one of the four that'll start an argument every time is which one is better, wing low or crabbed approach for a crosswind? Pick any one of those four, sit back, open your favorite beverage,
Relax.
watch the fun start.
Yeah. Maybe you can talk a little bit to the video because for sure you know it.
Yeah, I remember watching this one.
This accident could have been avoided, but the student forgot what his instructor had taught him. By not remaining
It's
calm, he
insane
lost
how the
directional
spring gear
control.
collapsed.
His use of ailerons, rudder, and elevator during the after-landing roll
Before
was...
you get lost in the nuts and bolts, I gotta set these guys straight on something.
Birddog, are
Gotta
you
love
here
the
again?
character.
I thought maybe I could get through one film without your able assistance.
Okay, I'll shut up. But first, I gotta say something.
That's what I mean. You can shut up and say something at the same time? All right, go ahead.
Look at this mess. Pay attention now. This Birddog is just barely worth fixing. But the guy who was flying it didn't even get a scratch.
As he flies base leg, he's calm and capable.
Full flaps.
But he gets himself into just the situation he'd hoped to avoid. He turns onto final too soon, and now he must try to readjust his position to align himself with the runway. The old panic takes over. As he comes in, he's so eager to get it on the ground that he rounds out a little high, and as the plane stalls, he bounces. He adds throttle for a go-around, but at that moment the plane touches down again. Now look, his feet are on the brakes. The plane swerves and he slams it in rudder and aileron to correct. The right brake goes down hard.
Holds the gear leg. Yep.
A severely damaged L19 caused by loss of
Didn't get the
directional
elevator,
control.
though. I'm gonna hand it to
No.
him. You know, for that training video, they actually ground looped the airplane on purpose. That wasn't just a student screwing up.
I know, because when you really know about the Birddog and you see the video, he pushed it into a ground loop. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Back when the monthly bark was still in paper, and it was however many sheets every month that got mailed to you, they did a series of articles interviewing the pilot who flew for all those training films.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, it was one of the test pilots at Fort Rucker.
Okay.
He did a lot of the flight. I mean, he did a bunch of the flying of the Birddog on skis where they're testing it on water skis.
Mhm.
He said, we only sunk it 5 times. By sunk it, my only being, it went to the bottom and the floor of the airplane was awash in the cabin. But yeah, they sunk it 5 times. And other things he's done, but he talked about doing those videos for like the ground loop and stuff like that.
Funny.
And yeah, there was one other time he was doing a demo for a bunch of colonels and generals, and they're in the bleachers, and it had something to do with laying communications wire, how they used to do it off the wing hard points. Well, they dropped the wire, it hit the ground, and it caught on something, and there was supposed to be a release for the spool and all that. It didn't release. It flew around in a circle. It ended up on the ground. One gear folded pretty much right in front of everybody. I was like, oh God, what a way to go. But,
I will share with you some pictures because I have, as the safety director, I always get all those crash videos and crash pictures of our planes. So just let me see.
yeah. Yep.
And what I often see is that there are Birddogs standing on the nose. So I think they often apply the brakes too aggressive.
Yeah, very
Like
very,
here, yeah.
Yep. Yep. That one flipped over in Florida. That one had just been sold to a high time airline pilot. And I'm trying to think of the guy who restored it. It'll come to me about 10 minutes after we hang up. But yeah, that's a shame. Another highly experienced pilot, and no one could tell him what or how to fly his airplane, and he put it on his back. I think it was the first or second flight after selling it. So
That's the Birddog of in Hawaii, or?
that might be, yes. It might be one of the Hawaiian tow planes, yes.
Yeah.
That's not the one the two got killed in, though. Oh, there's one that rolled up in a ball.
Yeah, but I think that's in Vietnam, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, U.S. Air Force gray, very likely. Vietnam, or it could be Florida, because they had them painted that way in Florida for training before they sent them over to Vietnam.
Yeah.
Yeah, Canadian tow plane, Canadian Air Cadets, they use Birddogs for towing sailplanes.
So how is it? I think that the risk of putting the Birddog on the nose with a 3-point is less compared to a 2-point landing.
Potentially, yes. Potentially, yes. A lot of times they end up on their nose too if they, off in the grass like that.
Yeah.
Alaskan Civil Air Patrol, that's what that one is. Yeah. And they get into soft ground and the main tires dig in and off they go. Yeah, there's some sad pictures here.
Yeah, this one here. That hurts.
Yeah.
This was a friend of us in Italy. He ground looped the plane, not too bad, but still enough to cause some damage.
Yeah.
And do you see here all those bandings
yes.
in the sheet? Yeah.
Yep, and that's an E model too, with the heavier duty, thicker gear leg and the heavier duty gearbox too.
Exactly, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a shame. Yeah.
This one is just a few years ago.
Okay. Can you zoom any closer on that one so we can see an N number or whatever? Yeah, that one. That one might have been one where the bolt holding the gear leg in failed. We've had that happen already too.
Another flip over, and
yeah, got
the
soft dirt.
Is you see they really got seriously injured.
That's too bad. It digs into the mud.
Yeah, another one.
And so much of that can be avoided. So much, that's why we say people should be trained by someone qualified in the Birddog, not their buddy who flew tail draggers 20,000 years ago,
Yeah, exactly.
There's minimal control, do it as cheap as possible. Training and checkouts in an airplane, that's for sure. That's a shame.
Okay, so far so good. I don't find this video of this lady, but it was shocking, to be honest, because she thought she was doing a great job, but no, she didn't.
That does happen. That does happen.
Good, sir. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Fred, for taking the time, especially on a Saturday night and staying up so late.
No problem. It was a pleasure.
I hope you don't have too much trouble making some semblance of a video out of this mess of mine.
I will mix it together anyway, yeah. But I think it will be very helpful for especially for bird dog owners that are new in this space, and maybe they also have some experience with tail draggers. But I think the message should be, even if you have experience with a tail dragger, be aware the bird dog is a very special plane. Nothing to be afraid of, but nothing to relax.
Yeah, it must be respected.
Yes.
It must be respected. And if you treat it like a heavy, high-performance tail dragger, think 180, 185 type weights, you'll be fine with it. But if you start thinking of it as something light, such as Super Cub, Citabria, Husky, 170, all of which weigh 200 to 600 pounds less, you can get yourself in trouble in a hurry. You fly by its speeds and it'll do just fine.
Yeah.
So it's been great talking to you, Fred. Thank you for your time, really.
Same, thanks.
And to all new bird dog owners, congratulations to your beautiful plane. The bird dog is nothing to be afraid of. Be a member of the International Bird Dog Association, and we will always be there to help you. And from the safety point, we also highly recommend you to wear helmets.